In the previous part of this lecture on Kamala Das's an introduction, I had mentioned what is called new Englishes, or more generally, just Englishes, English in the plural, right? And the very idea of Englishes or new English is the fact that there have been adjustments that have been made to the English language in many parts of the world which were colonized by the erstwhile British Empire, right? So I had spoken about two people. One was the African author Chinua Achebe, and I had also mentioned Salman Rushdie. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Rushdie in today's lecture. So I ended the previous lecture quoting Chinua Achebe, right? And the very specific quote was, "I feel that the English language will be able to carry the weight of my African experience, but it will have to be a new English, still in full communion with its ancestral home, but altered to suit its new African surroundings." Now, Salman Rushdie does something very similar, right? And what Chinua Achebe just said, the quotation that I just read out to you, these were the lines along which Salman Rushdie also aimed to put down his observations of Indianisms, right? And I had also briefly spoken about Indianisms in the previous class. So I had given you the example of the brinjal, right, which is called eggplant elsewhere, and there is this a strange word that has come out of where it's very difficult to say. The etymology of this word is not known, at least to me, right? So the point being that Indian English has its own nuances, has its own aberrations, right? Has its own character. If you are to, bring this all together, you could say that the English language in India, or the Indian English, has its own character, which is to say, it is a distinct, perhaps dialect of English language, right? So we have uh, a lot of, when we think about Indianisms, there are a lot of things that Indians specifically do, and brinjals was just one example, but I'll give you a handful of examples, right? So one very common Indianism is when someone asks you, what is your good name? Now, see, there is no concept of good name and bad name in English, right? As far as British or American English or even Australian English is concerned, there is simply no concept of someone having a good name and a pet name or bad name, whatever you choose to call it. But when Indian sensibilities are translated into English, that is when the concept of good name comes into being, right? So, for example, in Bengali, we have bhalo naam, right? And then there is another name everyone has at home, right? So now that very concept did not exist in British or American or Australian cultures, or many other Englishes for that matter. So the point being that when Indian sensibilities or Indian culture got translated into English, due to the fact that the English did colonize our country for 200 more than 200 years. So these got intertwined, and that led to these unique bits of language being added to the English language, right? And that is a very Indian characteristic of the English language, because in Indian languages, in Indian cultures, most Indian cultures, we do have this concept of having a good name, and another name, pet name of sorts, or nickname, right? So one more example, and this is obviously an Indianism, but it is also a mistake. It's also a technical mistake, right? So a lot of people, I've heard people say this: it's raining outside, right? It's raining outside is technically incorrect, because it definitely rains outside, right? It's raining is full sentence. You don't have to say it's raining outside, right? But a lot of Indian people will say that. So this is also an Indianism. And if anyone says it's raining outside, I really won't go out and point out to that person that what you said is a technical mistake. It's technically incorrect, or well, a redundancy of sorts. So once again, the point being that Indian English has a character of its own. Some of it is obviously derived from Indian cultures and Indian languages, right? And people like Salman Rushdie have taken up those Indian characteristics, and they have used that in their writing, right? And Chinua Achebe has also done something similar with his African experience. So I will read Chinua Achebe's quote once more to you before talking about Salman Rushdie in a with greater detail. So Achebe's quote goes like this, and please follow in light of the conversation, in light of what I just told you. So the quote is, I feel that the English language will be able to carry the weight of my African experience, but it will have to be a new English, still in full communion with its ancestral home, but altered to suit its new African surroundings. So the ancestral home of English is, of course, England, and suited to, altered to suit new surroundings is obviously a reference to the colony, whether it's Africa or whether it's India, or whether it's any other, Hong Kong perhaps, who knows, right? So as the English language developed into the primary second language, and the conventional language of office in many countries, education policies and learning standards also began to evolve, right? So psychological attitudes to this foreign language changed from imitating or aping, to accommodating, and then finally to appropriating, in that order, right? So three terms you need to understand here. One is aping. Aping basically means imitating. If you remember, the classes where I spoke about Aristotle's theories rather, I may have mentioned a word called mimesis, right? So mimesis means imitation, right? So what I'm trying to tell you is that as education policies changed in these erstwhile colonies, such as India, or such as South Africa, or in many of the Caribbean countries, and this is only when it comes to the English language. If you take the French language, something similar happened to the French colonies. If you take the Spanish language, something similar happened to the Spanish colonies in Latin America, right? So the principle is the same. First, there is a colonizer. There is a group of colonizers rather. In the case of India, it was predominantly the British. There have been isolated colonies, smaller colonies of the French, the Portuguese, etc., etc. But predominantly, it was the British. And when the British left India to Indians, for Indians to run the government, English had already become the accepted language. Now, we will take a small detour here at this juncture. If you remember, I mentioned this before to you, and I definitely put this in many of the quizzes, right? In the history of English literature, or in the history of English language as well, that for a long time in the history of England, in the history of Britain, French was the official language, right? So, because it was the French kings or the French invaders who had for a long time held their power over what is today known as England, or what is today called the British Island, right? So, similarly, when the British started expanding their colonies, they took their language with them, and eventually the English language became the official language of many of these countries, including, of course, India, right? So as the English language developed into the primary second language, so in our country, English is definitely the primary second language, and the conventional language of offices in these countries like India naturally became English. So as I was saying in the previous class, that in West Bengal, for example, two languages are used officially. One is, of course, Bengali, and the other is English. So in some parts, Nepali is also used because there's a significant Nepali speaking population in North Bengal, right? Specifically in the Darjeeling area, in Kalimpong area. So that is also accepted as a official language in West Bengal. But if you take the other states, they also have the dominant language of the state and English. So in the case of Kerala, it's Malayalam and it's English, right? In the case of Tamil Nadu, it's Tamil and it's English, of course, right? In the Hindi belt, once again, it's Hindi, and the English is also used as an official language, right? So the point being that even though the colonizers left the country, the effect of English colonialism is still felt, at least in our official communication. Now, the fact that I am taking an English class with you is different. It's separate because is separate for the reason that for you English is not the second language, right? For you it's the like first language of sorts, because English is the subject that you have chosen. So this is a different equation, and there are more nuances to this, and it's possible to have longer conversations about it, but I'm going to avoid that for now. So as I was saying, psychological attitudes towards these foreign languages changed from imitating or aping to accommodating, right? So how did this begin? So when the British first came and they occupied the Indian territory, and kind of asserted their military power, it became necessary for Indians to also start learning their language, right? Just for the sake of communication. Communication cannot happen if you don't know language, right? Whether it's the English language, if you're communicating with an Englishman, whether it's sign language, uh, whether if you're talking with a differently abled person, or whether it's a computer language, whether it's Java when you're communicating with a computer, right? So language is necessary for communication, which is why the first step of language learning is always imitation, right? And that is also how children learn to speak, infants learn to speak, right? So the first stage was aping or imitating, or if you want to use the more fancy Aristotelian terminology, it's mimesis. So stage one was imitation. Stage two is accommodating, right? Accommodating is when is what we often do. We speak in a very hybrid language these days. A lot of us, I notice too many people doing this, and I find myself doing this at times. That is, I will blend my mother tongue with a bit of English, or something like that, right? I'm sure all of you have done it at some point. So that is, accommodating. You accommodate one language into the other. So I am basically speaking Bengali, but I will be adding a few English words here and there, right? And it will still make sense, not only to me, but also to the person I'm speaking to, which is when communication becomes complete, right? So communication, remember, is a two-way process. If one person speaks like I am doing in this recorded lecture, that cannot be called communication. Communication is only possible when there is a feedback, right? When there is back and forth, when information or data or words are exchanged from both sides, that's when communication is complete. Otherwise it is not. It's a very like basic theory in communication studies, right? So stage 2 is accommodating, and the final stage is appropriating, right? This is kind of where we are at this moment in history, right? So we were colonized for some 200 years, a bit more than that, and then our education policies, our habits, etc., etc. We first imitated the English language, then we accommodated it into our speech, and now we are appropriating it. Appropriating it means basically means that you are making it your own, right? This is a very simplistic way I'm explaining it to you. Appropriating, the term appropriating can be used differently in different places, but here it basically means that at this moment in history, standing in 2021, we have reached a point where after 70 plus years of independence, we have made the English language our own, to the point that we have added words to it. Not only have we done that, we have added many flavors to it, and this is what uh, Salman Rushdie calls chutneyfication, right? So the Queen's English, that is the Queen of England's English, is no longer the norm, right? And many Englishes have come up in different colonies that the English travel to. Now, one among them is what Salman Rushdie drew a picture of in his very famous novel, Midnight's Children. So there are scholarly perspectives of his work which show that his coinage of the term chutneyfication of English, which discuss this term in the Indian subcontinent. Now, as you know, chutney, I'm sure everyone knows what a chutney is. It's basically a tangy Indian side dish, right? that has several flavors and complements. I meant it complements the main course. So it is a side dish with multiple flavors, and it complements the main course. So if and fication um, is supposed to describe the metamorphosis of English in post-colonial India, right? So that's how the word chutneyfication is formed. So if you remember your lessons from semester one, you probably have come across the term portmanteau. Portmanteau is when you bring two words together and form a new word, right? So that's what Salman Rushdie did this when he coined the term chutneyfication, right? So if the main course is English, then the side dish is the Indianness that gets added to the main course, right? And that is how you have a new flavor which is there in Indian English. In the previous lecture, I also referred to an interview by Shashi Tharoor, who has who actually speaks a lot about these things about Indian English, and who actually claims that Indian English should be recognized as a language in its own right, because it is quite distinct in many ways. It is distinct from American or British or Australian English. So in cultural studies, there is a concept called hybridity, and this is the concept I'm going to focus on next. And these are ideas very relevant to Kamala Das, as I will try to explain to you by the end of today's lecture, hopefully. Okay, so as I was saying, in cultural studies, there is a concept called hybridity. Now, some very well-known scholars, one of them is Homi Bhabha, have written and lectured a lot about this concept of hybridity. So historically, when the British colonizers occupied different parts of the world, the colonizers, such as us Indians or South Africans, and even the Hong Kongese, they succumbed to it by first trying to emulate or aping them. Like I said, so three stages. First is aping or imitating, second is accommodating, and third is appropriating, right? Three stages of post-colonial development of language, right? So first we succumbed, we had to accept it, we tried emulating or copying them. Okay, so however, with time, imitation or aping evolved into accommodation, right? And several Firangi words. Firangi was the term used for the white-skinned people at that time, and eventually we moved on from imitating to accommodating several of these Ferengi words and culture-specific behaviors, right? Like I said, culture-specific. I already gave you an example of culture-specific behavior at the beginning of this lecture. With the example of good name. Good name is a very culture-specific thing. We have this in Bengali. We have this in almost every part of India, as far as I know. Obviously, there are parts of India I don't know anything about, but in most parts that I know of, at least the Hindi speaking region, the Bengali speaking regions, and even in many parts of South India, that concept is there of good name and a pet name or nickname, right? So this is a culture specific behavior. So one more culture specific behavior you can easily identify with is what is known as in Bengali eto খাবার, right? So this basically refers to leavings of someone's plate. Someone has eaten, has not completed eating it, or then someone else eats that, the leftover. So that concept is something that wasn't there in the English language. So you do not have an exact translation for it, right? So again, the concept of jhal, right? That too is a problematic concept when you translate it into English, because in the English people will just say spicy or hot, but that does not exactly translate the concept of jhal, right? So remember, there are culture specific behaviors which are very difficult to translate into other languages. Now this is not a problem specific to Bengali to English, or English to Hindi, or Malayalam to English. It's not a problem specific to these languages. It is a problem everywhere. It is an issue, and you may ask what is being done about this issue. So that is a different discussion. Now let's focus on hybridity. Let's return back to hybridity, right? So remember, stage one is imitating, emulating, or aping. Stage two is accommodating, when you take up words from that other language and blend it into your own. Like the example I was giving you, that very often, many of us, while speaking our mother tongue, we will bring in a few English words, and then it will still make sense to not only us but also to the person we are communicating to. So, the beauty of hybridity lies in the eventual appropriation of English as one's own. Like I explained a few moments earlier, appropriation means when you take something and make it your own, right? So this English is no longer the Queen's English, basically not the English that the Englishmen and Englishwomen speak, but something that has penetrated to multiple strata of post-colonial society, incorporating their tendencies and typical characteristics in the process, right? So it has become very Indian. Like, take the example of brinjal, take the example of it's raining outside, takes the example of good name. These are all examples of how we have appropriated the English language, and we have you know taken elements of our mother languages, of our culture, and blended it in with English. And henceforth, we have a very hybrid language, something that Homi Bhabha calls hybridity, and chutnification is no different. Chutnification is very similar, right? But yes, these are more nuanced, and you need to understand these better, and you will eventually have to read them and study them as you move further up in studying English literature. So there is a South African comedian you must all watch. His name is Trevor Noah. So he's currently the host of the globally famous Daily Show, right? You will find most of those episodes on YouTube. You must watch his acts on Indian and South African English, right? And that will give you an idea of what appropriation and accommodation refers to, right? So watch his videos and let me know if you don't find them. But it's very easy. Just Google. Actually, just go on YouTube and search for Trevor Noah. So now let's come back to our poet, Kamala Das, and see how all these ideas that we have studied in this lecture and the previous one, how can we all bring them together? So remember, we began speaking about language. We know that language and identity are tied, right? In fact, language is part of our identity. Um, and The other two things that we spoke about is chutnification and hybridity. Chutnification is a term that Salman Rushdie gave us. Hybridity is a term that Homi Bhabha gave us. All right. So our poet here, Kamala Das, is seen to advocate the same kind of linguistic freedom and personalization. Right? Same kind meaning same kind as prescribed by Chinua Achebe or Salman Rushdie or Homi Bhabha. So for Kamala Das, language is a medium of communication. It is a mode of self-expression. Therefore, it is personal. Right? Now go back and read the lines again, and then think of what I just said. So at the same time, she talks about ownership of language. Now this is an important statement to make, because when it comes to women, ownership continues to be a highly problematic word, right? So she breaks, I mean, Kamala Das breaks a lot of boundaries to claim such kind of linguistic rights, right? Which show her revolutionary spirit. So, like I was saying, language and identity are tied. I'm sure you all know about the relevance of 21st February, right? About Bhasha Andolon, right? And you also probably know about International Mother Language Day. And this is one event which was celebrated very well in Rani Birla, right? I was part of only one of these events, but this was before the pandemic and it was celebrated quite well. And International Mother Language Day is celebrated everywhere in the world. It has a lot to do with the Bengali language, actually, because the story goes that this is just to show you how language and identity are tied, right? One example, because there have been revolutions, there have been wars because of language. Um, and I mentioned Benedict Anderson in the previous class. Benedict Anderson also speaks about the importance of language in identity formation, more importantly, in the formation of nations and states. Okay, so briefly I'll tell you the story of International Mother Language Day, and you will see the relevance. You'll begin to see the relevance of personalized languages in the context of Kamala Das. So the story goes that when India was divided, that is after partition, um, as you know that India and Pakistan were formed, with West Pakistan consisting of what is today Pakistan, and East Pakistan consisting of what is today Bangladesh. Right now, the problem which started after partition in Pakistan was what the official language would be, because the at that time the more developed Bangladesh, what is present day Bangladesh, it was East Pakistan at that time, and East Pakistan was more developed, and the language here was Bengali, while in West Pakistan the language was in some places Punjabi, right, a blend of Punjabi, and in some places it was Urdu, right. But the officially they wanted, the Pakistani government at that time wanted to use Urdu as the official language of the country, or the national language, as you may. And this was, of course, met with resistance in East Pakistan, or what is today Bangladesh. Right now, in the 1950s, early 1950s, there were many protests, and many of these protests led to police firing, led to deaths, led to even more protests, and eventually, um, you know how this resulted in the end. Bangladesh became an independent country, but and it there are many factors to it, and I'm not going to go into that, but I want to emphasize on the aspect of language here, right. So remember, language and identity are tied, and one of the identities along which Bangladesh was formed was language, right? And later, the United Nations recognized this protest of 21st February as the International Mother Language Day, which is why you have International Mother Language Day being celebrated everywhere across the world now. Okay, so the point that I want you to take away from this is language and identity are intrinsically tied, right? So it's, in fact, it's more tight than you might imagine now. But eventually, since you are literature students, you will only begin to understand this better, and you will have only a deeper sense of how language and identity are tied. um, okay, so coming back to Kamala Das, she talks about the ownership of language. And remember, this is a very important statement, because when it comes to women, ownership is a highly problematic word in a patriarchal society, right? Until very recently, women did not even have the right to inherit property, as you know, right? So this is India we are talking about. So ownership is always a problematic word, and people like women like Kamala Das have literally, made a war out of it. And this poem is just an expression of that war. It's like a weapon in her arsenal. Right. So she breaks a lot of boundaries to claim such kinds of linguistic rights, which show her revolutionary spirit. Right. So in this sense, she is also a revolutionary. Right. Which is also why we are talking about identity language today. So as you can see, she's already very successful. So about her language, she says, and I'll be quoting a few lines from the poem. She says about her language, it is half English, half Indian. Hopefully, you are able to see the hybridity and chutnification. It is half English, half Indian, funny perhaps, but it is honest. It is as human as I am human. Don't you see? It voices my joys, my longings, my hopes, and it is useful to me as cawing is to crows and roaring to the lions. It is human speech, the speech of the mind that is here and not there. A mind that sees and hears and is aware, not the deaf, blind speech of trees in storm, or of monsoon clouds, or of rain, or the incoherent mutterings of the blazing funeral pyre. So she uses a lot of similes here. And again, simile is something I spoke about in the first lecture. So I'm not going to explain all of those again, but you already know the significance of similes. I expect you to study and understand what these similes mean. I have already introduced you to how to study similes. But the point of what I just quoted from the poem was to show you how intrinsically a language is tied to Kamala Das's identity, and how chauvinistic she is, or jingoistic. Jingoistic means something you are ready to go into war for, right? You want to protect something that to such an extent that you would go to war for it. And for Kamala Das, it's language, right? So her language is half English, half Indian, and it's very funny. She's accept, but she also tells us that it is honest and it is as human as she is human, right? And she says that this language comes naturally to her as cawing comes to crows and roaring to the lions, right? So as you can see, she's very jingoistic about the language that she uses. So she goes on to further define the quality of this language. She relates her language to her emotions, her desires, and beliefs. Right? The cawing of the crows and roaring of the lions are languages of instinct. Right? They are not ornamental. The lions, when lions roar, or when any other animal uh, you know gives out a shriek, or makes the sound that they do, those are not embellishments, those are not ornaments, right? And therefore they are not filtered, they are not artificial. So Kamala Das wants to say that her language is as instinctive and honest as the voices of this uncorrupted world of animals. Her language does not pass through any artificial filter. On the other hand, she distinguishes her voice from the sounds made by inanimate objects of nature, such as the storm, the rain, clouds, or even a funeral pyre. Right? So these objects emit sounds not from any conscious agency of utterance, but very randomly. So Kamala Das is very specific about the element of agency in her utterance and the consciousness behind it. Right? So this ends our lectures, at least the topics and themes that I wanted to cover for Kamala Das's an introduction. Now, if you have specific questions, you are always welcome to use the mentoring slot, or you can also let me know if you have any questions, right? So the next poem that we are going to look at will be Jayanta Mahapatra's Dawn at Puri, and I'll share the text of that poem with you.